The encounter. The sun was a fierce, unyielding ball in the afternoon sky, baking the bustling streets below in a haze of heat and tension. Officer Travis Daniels adjusted his sunglasses, the bright glare bouncing off the windows of downtown storefronts, making his eyes ache. His patrol beat was as familiar to him as the creases in his uniform. A mix of upscale cafes, small shops, and alleys where the city's forgotten residents often lingered. This neighborhood was his turf, and he took a certain pride in keeping it orderly. As he turned the corner, he spotted her. She was slouched on the pavement outside a coffee shop, a small cardboard sign resting against her knees. "Anything else? God bless," it read in uneven handwriting. Her clothes were mismatched layers of faded fabric, her once white sneakers caked with dirt. A threadbare scarf partially covered her disheveled hair. Beside her sat a battered canvas bag, probably holding all her worldly possessions. Travis sighed heavily. This was the third loitering complaint he'd dealt with that week. The shop owners and patrons didn't like the eyesore, as they called it, even though she was quiet and kept to herself. He strode over, his boots striking the pavement with measured authority, casting a long shadow over the woman. She looked up at him, her face gaunt and weathered, but her eyes sharp and alert. "Ma'am," he began, his tone crisp and professional, "you can't sit here. You need to move along." The woman blinked slowly, her thin fingers clutching the edge of her sign. "I'm not bothering anyone," she said softly, her voice raspy, as though she hadn't spoken much lately. "I'm just sitting here." Travis folded his arms, his patience already worn thin. "Loitering is loitering. The shop owners have complained. You're making customers uncomfortable." Her expression flickered with a mixture of disbelief and sadness. "I'm just trying to rest. I haven't asked anyone for anything." "It doesn't matter," Travis said, his voice hardening. "This isn't a shelter. If you don't pack up and move on, I'll have to call someone to escort you." Her shoulders tensed, and for a moment it looked like she might argue. But then she sighed, her thin frame sagging as she bent down to gather her belongings. "You don't know me," she said quietly as she stuffed her sign into her bag. "You don't know anything about me." "And I don't need to," Travis replied curtly. "Now move along." The woman rose to her feet with a deliberate slowness, her movements almost defiant. As she walked past him, she glanced back, her voice steady but tinged with hurt. "I hope you never find yourself in my position, officer, needing help from someone who sees you as nothing." Her words struck something deep, but Travis dismissed it with a shake of his head. He turned back to his patrol, muttering under his breath, "Just another day." Maggie, as the homeless woman was known to a few who had shared streets and stories with her, moved on through the city. The weight of her tattered bag pulled at her shoulders, but the sting of the officer's words lingered more heavily than any physical burden. She didn't always live like this. Once she had a cozy apartment, a nursing career she loved, and a husband who made her laugh until her cheeks ached. But a drunk driver on a rainy night had shattered it all. Her husband's death, followed by mounting medical bills from her own injuries, had left her with nothing. The eviction notice came as no surprise. Since then, she'd fought every day to survive, finding small moments of solace in helping others with her remaining skills. Maggie trudged toward her makeshift shelter, a spot beneath an overpass where a few others gathered for safety in numbers. As she approached, a boy no older than 16 waved her over. Even had been sick for days, his pale face and sunken eyes betraying his attempts to act tough. "Hey, Maggie," he called, his voice weak but managing a smile. "You got anything for a fever?" She knelt beside him, pressing the back of her hand to his clammy forehead. "Even," she said with concern, "you're burning up. This isn't just a fever. When did this start?" 2 days ago, he admitted, avoiding her gaze. "I'll be fine." "No, you won't," Maggie said firmly. "You need medicine, and you need it now." "I don't have any money," he muttered, his bravado crumbling. "What am I supposed to do?" Maggie sighed, pulling the last crumpled bills from her pocket. "Stay here," she said. "I'll be back." Choices and consequences. The evening air hung heavy as Maggie stepped out of the small corner pharmacy, clutching a brown paper bag. Inside were the fever reducers and electrolyte packets she'd scraped together what little money she had left to purchase. Her stomach growled, a reminder that she had just sacrificed her next meal to buy the supplies for Even, but she dismissed the thought. Hunger was temporary. Helping him survive was more important. As she walked back to the overpass where Even and the others had gathered, her mind replayed the earlier encounter with Officer Daniels. His words, sharp and dismissive, echoed louder than the city's evening bustle. She felt anger, but not just at him. It was anger at the world, at the systems that let people like her slip through the cracks, and at herself for sometimes believing she might deserve it. Her footsteps quickened as she approached the small encampment. A few familiar faces greeted her with cautious smiles, their eyes flicking to the bag in her hand. They knew Maggie as someone who helped when she could, even if it meant going without herself. She knelt beside Evan, who was now curled up in his thin blanket, shivering. "Here," she said softly, pulling the fever reducers and electrolyte packets from the bag. She helped him sit up, poured some water into a chipped plastic cup, and handed him the pills. "Take these." Slowly. Even hesitated, his pride wrestling with his need for help. But he knew Maggie wouldn't take no for an answer. He swallowed the pills and sipped the water as she gently pressed her hand to his forehead again, feeling for any sign of improvement. "Thank you," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't owe me anything," Maggie replied, her tone firm. "Just get better." The others watched her, their silence speaking volumes. She had become something of a pillar among them, not because she had resources, but because she had heart. While others were hardened by the streets, Maggie's softness persisted, even when it cost her. Across town, Officer Travis Daniels sat in his car, the evening shift winding down. He had parked on a quiet street to take a moment, leaning back against the seat and staring blankly at the ceiling of the patrol car. His thoughts were a tangled web of frustration, fatigue, and guilt. The face of the homeless woman he confronted earlier kept intruding into his mind, unbidden. The calm defiance in her eyes, the quiet way she had said, "You don't know me," struck a nerve he didn't want to admit existed. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it didn't matter. He had a job to do, and personal feelings didn't belong in it. But something deeper gnawed at him. Travis wasn't always like this, hardened, dismissive, quick to judge. Years ago, when he first joined the force, he believed in the good he could do. He believed he could make a difference. But time and the unrelenting weight of the job had worn him down. The city felt like a sinking ship, and his badge felt more like an anchor than a lifeline. It was easier to push people away than to care. His radio crackled to life, pulling him from his thoughts. Unit 301, report of a disturbance near East End Warehouse District. Possible gang activity, requesting backup. Travis sighed heavily and picked up the receiver. Unit 301 en route, he replied, starting the engine. It was probably another dead-end tip, he thought, just like all the others. Maggie had just finished helping Evan settle in for the night when she overheard the faintest snatches of conversation from one of the older men in the group. He was sitting on an overturned crate, speaking in a low conspiratorial tone to another man she didn't recognize. "I'm telling you," the older man said, his voice gravelly from years of smoking. "The warehouse on 14th. They've been moving something big in there. Weapons, maybe. Whatever it is, it's not legal." Maggie's ears perked up. She moved closer, her curiosity overriding her caution. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice steady but probing. The older man looked at her warily. "Nothing you need to worry about, Maggie. Just some rumors. Forget I said anything." But Maggie couldn't forget. She'd heard whispers about the warehouse district for weeks, the kind of talk that made her uneasy. She thought about the gang members who often lurk near the shelters, intimidating those who had nothing to offer but their silence. If something dangerous was happening there, it wasn't just the police who needed to know. The people on the streets, the vulnerable ones, deserved to be safe. Still, she hesitated. She had no proof, just a vague sense of unease. And the last time she tried to speak to an officer, she'd been met with scorn. What would someone like Officer Daniels do if she approached him again? Laugh in her face. Ignore her. But if there was even a chance she could prevent someone from getting hurt, she had to try. Travis arrived at the warehouse district, his patrol car the only sign of life in the desolate area. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that set his instincts on edge. He parked a block away and approached on foot, his hand resting lightly on his holstered weapon. The warehouses were old and crumbling, their walls covered in layers of graffiti. As he moved closer to the address provided in the tip, he spotted a van parked near one of the buildings. The vehicle was nondescript, but its presence in an otherwise abandoned area immediately raised his suspicion. He crouched behind a stack of rusted barrels, observing as a group of men began unloading crates from the van. His gut told him this wasn't just a random delivery. The men were quick, efficient, and clearly trying to avoid drawing attention. Travis squinted, trying to make out the markings on the crates, but they were unmarked. Reaching for his radio, he cursed under his breath. He had left it in the car. He could go back for it, but by the time he returned, the van might be gone. He needed proof, something to justify calling for backup. His decision to stay would cost him. The breaking point. The warehouse loomed like a dark sentinel under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. Inside, the shadows played tricks on Officer Travis Daniels' vision as he crouched behind a stack of rusted barrels, watching the group of men work swiftly. The crates they were unloading from the van were large and heavy, their movements deliberate and practiced. He strained his ears to catch fragments of conversation, but their voices were too low, drowned out by the occasional clatter of shifting metal. He reached for his belt instinctively, only to curse under his breath when he remembered his radio was in the patrol car, parked a block away. Backup wasn't an option, not unless he wanted to risk losing the evidence entirely. His eyes flicked between the men and the dimly lit exit. Leaving would mean forfeiting the chance to stop whatever was happening here. Travis inhaled deeply, steadying himself. His plan was simple: observe, gather enough intel, and get out. But as he adjusted his position to get a better view, the faint scrape of his boot against the concrete betrayed him. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough. "Did you hear that?" one of the men asked sharply, his head snapping toward the barrels. Travis froze, his heart pounding in his chest. One of the others, a wiry man with a tattoo curling up his neck, pulled a pistol from his waistband. "Check it out," he said, his voice low and menacing. Before Travis could retreat, the man's flashlight beam swept over the barrels, landing squarely on his crouched figure. "We've got company," the man barked, raising his weapon. Instinct took over. Travis ducked and rolled behind another stack of crates as a hail of gunfire erupted, the deafening cracks of the shots reverberating through the cavernous space. He returned fire, aiming low to disable rather than kill. One of the men yelped and fell to the ground, clutching his leg. But Travis was outnumbered and outgunned. The remaining men moved with precision, their bullets shredding the air around him. One shot grazed his shoulder, sending a searing pain through his body. He bit back a curse, his grip tightening on his firearm. Then came the second shot, a direct hit to his thigh. The impact sent him sprawling onto the cold, unforgiving concrete. Blood seeped rapidly through his uniform, pooling beneath him as he tried to crawl to cover. His vision blurred as the pain became unbearable. The gang didn't stick around to finish the job. With their van now loaded, they peeled out of the warehouse, leaving Travis bleeding and alone. Meanwhile, Maggie sat beneath the overpass with Even and the others, her mind restless despite the quiet night. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The older man's warning about the warehouse on 14th Street replayed in her mind, each word carving deeper into her instincts. "Where are you going?" Evan's weak voice called out as Maggie rose to her feet and grabbed her bag. "Just checking something," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'll be back soon." Her path to the warehouse was one of caution and familiarity. The streets in this part of the city were darker, quieter, places where people like her often disappeared without a trace. As she approached the looming structure, the first thing she noticed was the eerie stillness. The van was gone, but the faint smell of gunpowder lingered in the air. Then she saw the blood trail. Her heart skipped a beat as she followed it, her steps quickening. When she rounded the corner of the crates, she froze. There, slumped against the cold concrete, was Officer Travis Daniels. His uniform was soaked with blood, his face pale and contorted in pain. His weapon lay just out of reach, and his breaths came in shallow, ragged gasps. "Officer," Maggie called out, rushing to his side. Her voice was sharp but steady, her nursing instincts kicking in. Travis's eyelids fluttered open at the sound of her voice. For a moment, confusion flickered in his pain-glazed eyes. "Maggie," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "It's me," she said firmly, dropping to her knees beside him. "Stay with me." Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, tearing strips from her coat to fashion a makeshift tourniquet around his thigh. The bleeding from his shoulder wasn't as severe, but she pressed a cloth against the wound to stem the flow. "You're going to be okay," she murmured, her tone resolute despite the panic clawing at her chest. "But you have to hang on." Travis let out a weak, bitter laugh that turned into a cough. "Why? Why are you helping me?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. Maggie didn't look up as she worked. "Because you need it," she replied simply. "And I don't walk away when someone's in trouble." Her words stung in a way Travis hadn't expected. He thought of how he'd dismissed her just days ago, how he belittled her and ignored her humanity. And now, here she was, saving his life without hesitation. Maggie fumbled for her phone and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, she gave them the location and details of the officer's condition. "Send an ambulance immediately," she said, her voice firm. "He's losing a lot of blood." The dispatcher assured her help was on the way. But Maggie didn't wait idly. She stayed by Travis's side, her hands never faltering as she applied pressure to his wounds. "You're tougher than you look," she said, attempting to keep him conscious. "Don't prove me wrong now." Travis managed a faint smirk, though his strength was fading fast. "Guess. I owe you one," he mumbled. "You owe me nothing," Maggie replied firmly. "Just stay alive." The wail of sirens pierced the stillness, growing louder with each passing second. Relief flooded Maggie's chest as she saw the red and blue lights approaching. Paramedics burst through the warehouse doors moments later, their movements swift and professional. One of them knelt beside Maggie, assessing Travis's condition. "You did good," the paramedic said, glancing at her bloodied hands. "You probably saved his life." Maggie stepped back as they lifted Travis onto a stretcher, her body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. She watched as they wheeled him toward the ambulance, the doors closing with a loud thud before it sped away into the night. Standing alone in the dimly lit warehouse, Maggie let out a shaky breath. Her mind raced with the events that had just unfolded. She had saved him, someone who had seen her as nothing more than a problem to be dealt with, and yet she couldn't bring herself to regret it. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against something cold and metallic. Pulling it out, she realized it was Travis's badge, half covered in blood. She stared at it for a long moment before slipping it back into her pocket. As she stepped out into the night, a sense of resolve settled over her. Their paths had crossed in a way neither of them could have anticipated, and Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Redemption's crossroads. The rhythmic hum of hospital machines filled the quiet room, each beep and whir a steady reminder that Officer Travis Daniels had barely escaped death. His eyelids fluttered open, and the harsh fluorescent light made him squint. The sterile smell of antiseptic stung his nostrils, and the dull ache in his leg and shoulder grounded him in reality. He wasn't in the warehouse anymore. "Good morning," a nurse greeted as she entered the room, clipboard in hand. She was middle-aged, with kind eyes that softened the stiffness of the clinical environment. "You're lucky to be alive, Officer Daniels." The paramedic said someone administered first aid on the scene. "Without it, you wouldn't have made it." Travis nodded weakly, the memory of Maggie's face flashing before him. "The woman, Maggie," he murmured. "She's the one who helped me." The nurse tilted her head. "She didn't give us her full name, just said to make sure you made it." Then she left. Quite the guardian angel, it seems. Guardian angel. The words echoed in Travis's mind, filling him with a strange mix of gratitude and shame. He had dismissed Maggie as a nuisance, mocked her without knowing her story, and yet she had saved him. He leaned back against the pillows, the weight of his actions settling over him like a heavy blanket. Meanwhile, across town, Maggie sat beneath the familiar overpass, her makeshift shelter offering little comfort from the chill of the morning air. Her hands were still stained with traces of blood, the events of the previous night replaying over and over in her mind. She had no idea if Travis had survived, but the image of his pale face and the weight of his badge in her pocket wouldn't leave her. Even, now looking slightly better after a night of rest, shuffled over to her. "Maggie," he said, his voice still hoarse but stronger than before. "You were gone all night. What happened?" She glanced at him, offering a small, tired smile. "I had to help someone. That's all." "Someone important?" he asked, his curiosity evident. She hesitated. "Important? I don't know, but someone who needed it." Even didn't push further, but his eyes lingered on her, filled with the quiet admiration that many in the group had for her. She wasn't just one of them. Maggie was their anchor. And though she rarely talked about herself, her actions spoke louder than any words. At the hospital, Travis's wife Lauren sat beside his bed, her expression a mixture of relief and frustration. "Do you even understand how close you came to dying?" she asked, her voice cracking as she fought back tears. "You could have left me and Maddie behind." Travis winced, not just from the physical pain, but from the raw emotion in her voice. "I know, Lauren," he said softly. "I wasn't thinking." "You haven't been thinking for a long time," she shot back. "You've been so angry, so distant. Do you even remember the last real conversation we had? The last time you sat down with Maddie and actually listened to her?" Travis closed his eyes, guilt flooding his chest. He had been spiraling for months, burying himself in work and using the stress of the job as an excuse to shut out his family. Lauren's words hit harder than the bullets that had nearly killed him. "Something needs to change," she continued, her tone softening but still firm. "You need to figure out what matters to you, Travis. Because this version of you, it's not the man I married." He nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "You're right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need to fix this." 2 days later, Travis sat in the hospital's small therapy garden, his leg propped up in a wheelchair. The crisp air bit at his skin, but it felt good to be outside, away from the beeping machines and endless questions about his recovery. His thoughts drifted back to Maggie, the quiet determination in her eyes as she saved his life. He needed to find her, not just to thank her, but to understand her. Who was this woman he had judged so harshly? And why did her actions haunt him in a way nothing else ever had? Maggie, meanwhile, found herself back near the cafe where she had first encountered Travis. She avoided the main street, sticking to the alleys and side paths where she felt invisible, but her thoughts were far from calm. The weight of Travis's badge in her pocket felt heavier with each passing hour. She had considered dropping it off at the nearest precinct anonymously, but something held her back. A part of her wanted to see him again, not for gratitude or recognition, but to remind him of what had happened, to show him that people like her weren't invisible, weren't worthless. As she lingered near the cafe's back alley, a familiar voice startled her. "Maggie?" She turned sharply, her eyes meeting Travis's. He was in plain clothes, leaning heavily on a cane, his face pale though determined. "You," she said, her tone a mix of surprise and wariness. "What are you doing here?" "I needed to see you," Travis replied, taking a step closer. I wanted to thank you." Maggie folded her arms, her posture defensive. "Thank me? For what?" "Saving the life of someone who sees me as nothing." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. But he didn't flinch. He nodded slowly. "I deserved that," he admitted. "I've been wrong about a lot of things. About you. About people like you." She raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "And now you've had an epiphany because I saved your life. Is that it?" "No," Travis said firmly. "I've had an epiphany because I realized how blind I've been. You didn't have to help me, Maggie. You could have left me there. And no one would have blamed you. But you didn't. And that says more about your character than I can ever hope to understand." Maggie's expression softened slightly, though her guard remained up. "I didn't do it for you," she said quietly. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." "And that's what makes you better than me," Travis replied. "You saw me as a person, even when I couldn't do the same for you." For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Finally, Maggie reached into her pocket and pulled out his badge. "Here," she said, handing it to him. "I kept it safe." Travis took the badge, his fingers brushing against hers briefly. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Maggie nodded, her gaze steady. "Do something with it, officer. Don't waste the second chance you've been given." As she turned to leave, Travis called out, "Maggie, wait." She paused, looking back at him. "Can I help you? In any way?" he asked. "I owe you my life." Maggie hesitated, the weight of his question pressing down on her. "Help someone else," she said finally. "Someone who needs it more than I do." And with that, she walked away, disappearing into the city's endless maze of streets. Travis watched her go, a newfound resolve settling in his chest. He didn't know how, but he was going to change, starting now. The ripple effect. Travis Daniels stood on his porch, leaning heavily on the cane that had become both his crutch and a stark reminder of his mortality. The autumn breeze carried the faint scent of leaves and distant rain, but his mind was elsewhere. His conversation with Maggie replayed in his head like a broken record. Her words, sharp but honest, had cut deeper than he anticipated. "Do something with it. Don't waste the second chance you've been given." He glanced at his badge, now polished and resting in his hand. It felt heavier than it ever had in his years of service. He'd always thought of himself as someone who upheld justice, but his encounter with Maggie made him question what justice even meant. Was it enforcing the law blindly, or was it seeing the humanity in people, even those society cast aside? Meanwhile, across the city, Maggie sat on a cracked wooden bench near a community center, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had spent the better part of the day navigating social services, hoping to find any semblance of assistance. But the system wasn't built for people like her, people who fell between the cracks of eligibility, denied help for reasons that seemed arbitrary. Her thoughts drifted back to Travis. She hadn't expected to see him again, let alone hear an apology from him. Most people didn't see her, much less acknowledge her pain. And yet she couldn't shake the unease that lingered in her chest. She had no room for optimism, not anymore. Kind words didn't fill an empty stomach or pay for a safe place to sleep. She looked down at her worn shoes, her mind racing with the faces of those she'd met on the streets. Even, who was still recovering from his fever, Clara, the elderly woman who shared scraps of bread with her. And Jace, a quiet but resilient man who kept to himself, but always had a kind word for others. Their survival weighed on her as much as her own. The next morning, Travis walked into the precinct for the first time since his injury. He ignored the murmurs of surprise and curiosity from his colleagues as he made his way to his desk, his cane tapping against the linoleum floor. His partner, Officer Jake Mercer, was the first to approach. "Daniels," Jake said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon. How's the leg?" "Still attached," Travis replied dryly, lowering himself into his chair. "That's what matters." Jake chuckled, but his expression turned serious. "Look, I heard about what happened. You're lucky to be alive. They said some homeless lady saved you. Is that true?" Travis's jaw tightened. "Her name's Maggie." "And yes, she did." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Huh. Guess it's true what they say. Angels come in all forms. So, what's next for you? Are you ready to hit the streets again?" Travis shook his head. "Not yet. I've got some things I need to figure out first." Jake gave him a curious look but didn't press further. As he walked away, Travis opened his desk drawer and pulled out a folder labeled Community Outreach. It was a program the precinct had started years ago, but had all but abandoned due to lack of funding and interest. Travis stared at the folder, his mind racing. That afternoon, Maggie was walking through a narrow alley when she noticed a crowd gathered near a chain-link fence. The hum of conversation drew her closer, and she recognized several familiar faces from the shelters. At the center of the group was Travis Daniels, dressed in plain clothes, with a folding table set up in front of him. On the table were boxes of canned goods, bottled water, and first aid supplies. "What's this about?" Maggie asked one of the men in the crowd, her skepticism evident. "Cops handing out supplies," the man replied with a shrug. "Said something about helping the community." Maggie hesitated, her instinct to avoid police clashing with her curiosity. Finally, she stepped closer, her eyes narrowing as she watched Travis hand a box of supplies to a young mother holding a baby. His movements were awkward, his limp pronounced, but his expression was earnest. When their eyes met, Travis gave her a small nod. "Maggie," he said, his voice steady, "I was hoping you'd show up." She crossed her arms, her posture guarded. "What's this? Some kind of PR stunt?" "No," Travis said firmly. "It's not about that. It's about making things right, or at least trying to." She studied him for a moment, searching for any sign of insincerity. "And what makes you think this is enough?" she asked quietly. Travis sighed, leaning on his cane. "I don't, but I have to start somewhere." Maggie didn't reply immediately. Instead, she watched as he interacted with the others, his actions careful and deliberate. For the first time, she saw something in him she hadn't seen before: humility. Over the next few weeks, Travis threw himself into the outreach program, using his connections within the precinct to secure more resources. He worked tirelessly, even as his injuries slowed him down. At first, the community was wary of his intentions, but as word spread, more people began to show up at his events. Maggie, too, found herself drawn to these gatherings, though she remained skeptical. She watched as Travis listened to people's stories, offering not just supplies, but also a sense of dignity. Slowly, her walls began to crack. One evening, as the crowd dispersed, Maggie approached him. "Why are you doing this, really?" she asked. Travis met her gaze, his expression earnest. "Because I've spent too long looking at people without seeing them. Because I've made mistakes I can't take back. And because someone once told me not to waste my second chance." Her lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. "You're stubborn, I'll give you that." Travis chuckled. "Takes one to know one." As the days turned into weeks, the connection between Travis and Maggie grew. They weren't friends, not yet, but there was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition of shared humanity. Maggie began to see that Travis wasn't just trying to redeem himself. He was trying to change, to be better. And for Travis, Maggie became more than a symbol of his guilt. She was a reminder of resilience, of the strength it took to survive in a world that often turned its back on people like her. He realized that his badge, once a shield, could also be a bridge, a way to connect with the people he had once ignored. As the ripple effects of their actions began to spread, Maggie's world started to shift. Evan's fever had broken, and with Travis's help, she found a clinic that would take him in. Others in her circle began to trust the outreach program, finding small glimmers of hope in a life that had often seemed hopeless. But Maggie still struggled with her own doubts. Could someone like her ever truly escape the streets? And could Travis's efforts really make a difference in a system so broken? These questions lingered, but for the first time in a long time, Maggie allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something better. Bridging the divide. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in hues of gold and deep purple, Maggie found herself walking back toward the underpass. Her footsteps were slow, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. The sight of Travis distributing supplies, bending over to listen to people he once might have ignored, left her conflicted. Her life had been shaped by disappointment, by promises broken and chances denied. And yet, here was this man, a cop who had belittled her just weeks ago, now standing in the same spaces she called home, trying to offer help. The weight of her skepticism clashed with the faint flicker of hope his actions stirred. When she reached the underpass, the familiar sight of Evan sitting cross-legged by the fire brought a small smile to her lips. He looked better, the fever finally behind him, though he still had a gauntness about him that worried her. "Maggie," he called out as she approached. "Did you go to that thing the cop's doing? Clara said you were there." She sat down beside him, her hands absently tugging at the frayed edges of her coat. "I went," she admitted. "It's different." Evan cocked his head, his youthful curiosity unrestrained. "Different good or different bad?" "Not sure yet," Maggie replied honestly. "It's hard to tell if it's real, or if he's just trying to clear his conscience." Evan studied her for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "He gave me some soup the other day," he said quietly. "Didn't ask me for anything. Just handed it to me and said I deserved better." Maggie's gaze flicked to him, surprise flickering across her face. "He said that?" Evan nodded. "Yeah." And for a second, I believed him. Her chest tightened at his words. She had spent so long guarding herself from disappointment that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to believe in something or someone. Across town, Travis sat in the cramped office of the precinct's community outreach coordinator, flipping through pages of grant applications and budgets. The room smelled faintly of old paper and stale coffee, and the harsh fluorescent light made his eyes ache. Officer Jake Mercer leaned against the doorframe, watching him with a bemused expression. "You've been at this nonstop," Jake said. "I barely recognize you anymore." Travis glanced up, a tired smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Good. That means I'm doing something right." Jake folded his arms, his tone light but probing. "So what's this really about, Daniels? Is this about her? The woman who saved you?" Travis set the papers down, leaning back in his chair. "It's not just about her," he said after a long pause. "It's about all of them. People like Maggie. They deserve better from us. And I've been part of the problem for too long." Jake let out a low whistle. "Never thought I'd hear you say that." "Neither did I," Travis admitted. "But I've been given a second chance, Jake. I don't want to waste it." Jake nodded slowly, a hint of respect creeping into his expression. "Well, if anyone can pull this off, it's you. Just don't burn yourself out in the process." A few nights later, Maggie found herself at another one of Travis's outreach events. This time, it was held in an abandoned community center he had convinced the city to reopen temporarily. Folding tables lined the walls, piled high with canned goods, blankets, and hygiene kits. Volunteers bustled about, handing out supplies and chatting with the people who had gathered. Maggie lingered near the entrance, her arms crossed as she observed the scene. She watched as Clara received a new winter coat and as Evan carefully selected a few items from a hygiene kit. For the first time, the boy seemed to carry himself with a hint of confidence, a reminder of the person he could become if given a chance. Her eyes shifted to Travis, who was standing near one of the tables, speaking to an elderly man with a soft tone that Maggie hadn't heard from him before. He seemed different, lighter, almost, as though the weight of his old bitterness was starting to lift. "Hey, Maggie," Even said, appearing beside her with a small bag of supplies. "Why are you just standing there? Go talk to him." She shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I'm not sure what I'd even say." "Maybe just thank him," Even suggested, "or tell him he's doing a good job. People like hearing that." Maggie let out a soft laugh. "You've got more courage than I do, kid." "Yeah, well," Even said with a grin, "you're the one who keeps telling me not to be afraid to speak up." She rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling. "Touché." After a moment's hesitation, she began walking toward Travis. He looked up as she approached, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "Maggie," he said, his tone warm, "I wasn't sure if you'd come." She shrugged, her hands stuffed into her coat pockets. "Just wanted to see if this was real." "And?" he asked, his gaze steady. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "It's a start." Travis smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that softened the sharp lines of his face. "That's all I can ask for." For the first time, Maggie felt the walls around her heart begin to crack, just slightly. She wasn't ready to trust completely, not yet. But standing there, in a room filled with people finding small glimmers of hope, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, change was possible. A new beginning. The air inside the community center buzzed with life, a stark contrast to the cold, quiet streets outside. People moved between tables stacked with donated supplies, exchanging cautious smiles and quiet words of thanks. For many, it was the first time they'd been treated as more than invisible. For Maggie, it was a reminder of the kindness that could exist in a world she'd long ago stopped believing in. She watched from the corner of the room as Travis Daniels spoke with Clara, who was holding a bright red coat she'd just received. The elderly woman's face lit up with gratitude as Travis leaned down, listening intently to her story. His posture was no longer rigid, his face no longer guarded. There was something different about him now, a softness that hadn't been there before. Maggie's chest tightened as she took in the scene. She had been so certain that people like him, people in positions of power, would never truly care about people like her. But watching him now, she realized she might have been wrong. Thinking about talking to him again, Even's voice broke through her thoughts. She glanced down at the boy, who was sitting on a folding chair with a new blanket draped over his shoulders. His cheeks were fuller now, his eyes brighter. He was still thin, but he no longer carried the hollow, defeated look that had haunted him when she'd first met him. "Maybe," Maggie replied, her tone guarded. Even grinned. "You should. I think he's one of the good ones." Across the room, Travis's thoughts mirrored Maggie's hesitation. He'd spotted her when she first arrived, lingering near the door with her arms crossed. He had learned enough about her by now to know that her guarded stance wasn't just about the room. It was about life. And he didn't blame her. As the last of the supplies were handed out, he made his way toward her, his cane tapping softly against the tiled floor. She turned as he approached, her expression unreadable. "Hey," he said, offering a small smile. "Thanks for coming." Maggie tilted her head slightly. "You're really sticking with this, aren't you?" "I am," Travis replied. "It's not just about showing up, though. It's about doing better." She studied him, her gaze piercing. "Doing better takes more than handing out supplies. You know that, right?" "I do," he said, nodding. "That's why I'm here, not just for tonight, but for the long haul." Her lips twitched into something resembling a smile. "You're stubborn." "I've been told," he replied with a chuckle. "But I think I'm learning from the best." The faintest laugh escaped her lips, and for the first time, Travis felt like they were standing on even ground, not as a cop and a homeless woman, but as two people trying to find their way. As weeks turned into months, the outreach program grew. Travis used his position to push for more resources, working tirelessly to convince local businesses and community leaders to support the initiative. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, resistance, and more than a few sleepless nights. But he refused to give up. Maggie became a quiet but integral part of the effort. She didn't trust easily, but she couldn't ignore the change she saw in Travis, or the impact the program was having on the people around her. Slowly, she began to lend her voice, offering insight into the needs of those on the streets and helping connect others to resources. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Travis stood outside the community center, leaning on his cane as he watched the last of the volunteers pack up. Maggie approached him, her hands shoved deep into her coat pockets. "You've done good," she said, her tone soft but genuine. Travis turned to her, surprised by the praise. "I've had help," he said, meeting her gaze. "I couldn't have done this without you." She shrugged, her cheeks flushing slightly. "I didn't do much." "You did more than you think," he replied. "You gave me a reason to start." For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Maggie spoke. "I don't know if I'll ever stop doubting," she admitted. "But it's nice to think that maybe not everyone's out to hurt us." Travis nodded, his expression somber. "Doubt's not a bad thing, Maggie. It keeps us questioning, keeps us honest." She glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe you're not so bad, Officer Daniels. And maybe you're the toughest person I've ever met," he replied with a grin. The real change came when Travis took his efforts beyond the precinct. He started attending city council meetings, advocating for affordable housing and mental health services. He partnered with local nonprofits to expand the outreach program, ensuring it wasn't just a temporary fix, but a lasting solution. And through it all, Maggie remained a constant presence. Though she still struggled with the uncertainty of her own life, she found purpose in helping others. Her nursing skills became invaluable as she assisted with first aid stations and health screenings. Slowly but surely, she began to believe in the possibility of a better future, not just for herself, but for the people she cared about. 1 year later, the community center buzzed with life once again. This time, it wasn't an outreach event, it was a celebration. The program had officially been expanded citywide, with plans to open permanent resource centers for the homeless and underserved populations. Maggie stood at the back of the room, watching as Travis gave a speech to the crowd. His words were simple but heartfelt, a reflection of the man he had become. "As a police officer, I thought my job was just to enforce the law," he said. "But I've learned that it's so much more than that. It's about protecting and serving everyone, no matter where they come from or what their circumstances are. And it's about recognizing the humanity in every person we meet." The crowd erupted into applause, and Maggie found herself clapping along, a rare smile lighting up her face. As Travis stepped down from the podium, their eyes met across the room. He nodded to her, a silent acknowledgement of everything they'd been through. Maggie nodded back, the walls around her heart finally beginning to crumble. In the end, it wasn't about redemption or gratitude. It was about connection, the kind that could only come from seeing and valuing each other as human beings. For Travis and Maggie, their paths had crossed in the most unexpected way, but it had changed them both for the better. And as they moved forward, they carried that change with them, determined to make the world just a little bit brighter. As the applause in the community center died down, Travis made his way through the crowd, leaning on his cane as he greeted familiar faces. Every handshake, every nod of appreciation, was a reminder of how far he had come, not just in his recovery, but in his understanding of what it meant to truly serve his community. He spotted Maggie standing near the back, her arms crossed, but her expression softer than he'd ever seen it. She had been a steady, quiet presence throughout the past year, but tonight, something about her felt different. There was a hint of pride in her eyes, a spark he hadn't seen before. "Maggie," he said as he approached, his voice warm. "Glad you made it." She shrugged, but a small smile tugged at her lips. "Wouldn't miss it. It's not every day you see a cop standing up for people like us. Not just standing up, Travis said, his tone sincere. Fighting for you. For all of us. She raised an eyebrow. All of us. Travis nodded. Yeah. Because you were right, Maggie. This isn't just about me making amends or clearing my conscience. It's about recognizing that everyone deserves a chance. A real chance. For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze searching his face for any hint of insincerity. But she found none. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. You've changed, she said. I didn't think it was possible, but you've changed. Travis smiled, the weight of her words settling in his chest. I had a good teacher. Maggie rolled her eyes, but the smile on her face widened. Don't push your luck, Daniels. The night ended quietly, but the impact of the celebration lingered. As people trickled out of the community center, Maggie found herself walking alongside Travis. The streets were quiet, the distant hum of the city fading into the background. They walked in comfortable silence, the kind that only came after shared struggles and hard-won understanding. So, Travis said, breaking the quiet, what's next for you? Maggie hesitated, her steps slowing. The question hung heavy in the air, but for once, it didn't feel overwhelming. I don't know, she admitted, but I think I'm ready to figure it out. Travis glanced at her, a small smile playing at his lips. You've got more strength than anyone I've ever met. Whatever you decide, I know you'll make it happen. She looked at him, surprised by the conviction in his voice. For so long, she had carried the weight of her own doubts, convinced that the world had no place for someone like her. But in that moment, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was right. What about you? She asked, turning the question back on him. You've been through a lot. What's next for you? Travis let out a thoughtful sigh. Keep fighting, he said simply. For people like you. For the ones who can't fight for themselves. And maybe, if I'm lucky, I'll keep learning how to be a better person along the way. Maggie nodded, the corners of her mouth lifting into a genuine smile. Sounds like a plan. Months later, their paths intersected once again. The resource center, now fully operational, was bustling with activity. Maggie stood at the front desk, a clipboard in hand, as she helped a young mother navigate the sign-up process for housing assistance. Her hair was pulled back neatly, and she wore a clean pressed shirt that had been donated by one of the center sponsors. She looked different, more confident, more hopeful, but her kind, steady presence remained unchanged. Across the room, Travis stood talking to a group of volunteers, his cane resting against a nearby wall. He caught sight of Maggie and gave her a nod, his expression filled with quiet pride. She nodded back, her smile small but sincere. They didn't need words. Their actions spoke for them. As the days turned into years, their efforts continued to ripple outward. The program expanded, inspiring other precincts and cities to adopt similar initiatives. Homelessness didn't disappear overnight, and the challenges of the world remained daunting, but progress was made, one life at a time, one act of kindness at a time. For Maggie, the streets became a memory. She found work at the resource center, using her nursing skills and her hard-earned wisdom to help others find their way. She still had her struggles, but for the first time in years, she had a sense of stability, of purpose. For Travis, the badge he once wore with pride now carried a deeper meaning. It wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a reminder of his responsibility to the people he served. And though he still bore the physical scars of his near-death experience, they became a testament to the lessons he had learned. In the end, it wasn't about redemption or recognition. It was about connection, the kind that bridges the deepest divides and reminds us all of our shared humanity. Maggie and Travis had started as strangers on opposite sides of a broken system, but together they had proven that change was possible. And as they continued their work, they carried with them the hope that even the smallest acts of compassion could change the world. Because sometimes saving a life means more than just stopping the bleeding. Sometimes it means healing hearts. your own and others, one step at a time.